With the sync connector for S3, you can move messages from your Pulsar topics into an S3 bucket. I'm going to assume that you already have an S3 bucket. Here I have one on the screen that is empty. It has no objects in it yet. So we're going to start out the video by first creating an AWS IAM policy and attach it to an existing user. This is the user that we're then going to connect to AWS with. Then you would also need to prepare your StreamNative Cloud cluster by creating a service account bindings, and adding the required permissions to your tenant and namespace. I'm not going to do that explicitly in this video, but there's a link in the description that includes the exact step-by-step directions on how to do that. Then we're going to deploy and test the Amazon S3 sync connector and show you what it looks like once that data has been moved over here into your Amazon S3 bucket. So the first thing I need to do is create that AWS IAM policy. To find the required permissions here, I've gone over to StreamNative.io. Just go to Learn StreamNative Documentation. Go to StreamNative Hub, search for my connector S3, and we're going to be using the AWS S3 sync connector. The permissions that are required here are we need the S3 put object and the S3 abort multi-part upload. And the resource I'll put down as the bucket as well as then all objects within that bucket. So here in IAM, I'll create that new policy. I'll go to Policies, Create Policy. The service it will refer to is S3. We're going to add those two permissions. One was put object. The other is abort multi-part upload. For the ARN, I'm going to add an ARN. For the bucket name, I'm going to say Pulsar connector. That's the name of that S3 bucket that I have. And then we'll say any object, which will add the /* there. I'll say add ARNs. Click Next. For the policy name, we'll just call this Pulsar connector. Scrolling down, I'll say create policy. Here I have my user, Pulsar S3 connector, that I already have created and I already have an access key for. So I already have the access keys here. We'll need those for the deployment, but I need to add the permissions. So I'm going to say add permissions, attach a policy directly, and I'll say Pulsar connector. Go ahead and select that, say next, and that will add the permissions to this user. I'm not going to go into the details in this video, but I have already created a service account. It's called the SQS service account. I'm reusing one from another connector. It is not an admin, and I've already downloaded the credential key. I've placed that file inside of a folder on my desktop, and I will show you how to set the context for Pulsarctl before we end up deploying the S3 sync connector. I also already have the required permissions on my tenant and namespace. Again, there's a link in the description that shows how to create the service account, how to create the service account binding, as well as provide the permissions on your tenant and namespace. So let's head over to terminal where I'm going to make sure I have my context set for Pulsarctl, and then we'll go through deploying the S3 sync connector. Here I am in terminal. I'm going to go ahead and set my context for test for using Pulsarctl so that when I log into my StreamNative cluster, it uses that service account that I want to deploy the connector with. So here's the code to do that. I'll go ahead and put that in the description as well. And now we're ready to actually go ahead and deploy the sync connector. Here's an example of the full Pulsarctl command that we'll be using to deploy the sync connector. We'll use syncs create to create the connector. It's built in the jar file, so we're going to use the archive built-in cloud storage. I'll be deploying to the S3 tenant and the S3 namespace. Those have permissions for that service account with the service account binding. And the input topic where we're going to read messages from that we want moved over to the S3 bucket is S3 tenant, S3 namespace, my S3 topic. You can technically deploy to a different tenant and namespace than where your input topic is. You can also specify multiple input topics, but that would require you to make sure you have the correct permissions on those additional tenants and namespaces. We're going to call the sync S3 sync, and then the sync config is the part of the sync that is specific, or configuration that is specific to which sync or source you're using. So if you're using sync, you're going to be using sync config. If you're doing a source, you're going to be doing source config. In this particular case, I need the access key ID and the secret access key from the AWS user. The provider here is S3 v2. The bucket I want to write to is Pulsar connector. That's the one I've given permissions to my AWS user. Then I have my region and my format and my petitioner type. Let's go ahead and copy this and we'll paste it into terminal now that we have Pulsarctl installed and it has the correct connection using the service account that we want to use to deploy this connector. Here I go ahead and paste that into terminal using Pulsarctl and it'll say it created S3 sync successfully. Here I am in the StreamNative UI. I've already selected my tenant and namespace here at the top, and I'm interested in the My S3 topic. That's the one we're going to be publishing data to, that we want moved over to our S3 bucket. So if I go over to connectors, it will already have syncs selected. And at this point, we should see our S3 sync show that it's ready, but that no messages have been received from Pulsar or written to the sync. Let me go ahead and bring up some Java code now, and we're going to write a few messages to that topic that we have signed up for to be moved over to S3. So here I have my Java code that's using the Pulsar Java client. I have a string schema here, and the topic is S3 tenant, S3 namespace, my S3 topic. This is the topic that we're signing up for to then send the data over to our S3 bucket. While it is a string message, it still is in a JSON format. Let's go over to the documentation and I'll show you why. Back in the documentation here for S3, there is a section, if you scroll down, on the data format types that are available. I'm using a Pulsar schema of a primitive, in this case it's a string, and the writer I've selected is JSON, where it says the JSON writer will try to convert the string data into a JSON format data if convertible. So it still has to be convertible to JSON even though it's technically stored as string. So mine is because I have a value and field and I'm in a JSON format even though it is technically a string inside of Pulsar. So let's go ahead and start up our producer. So we're going to go ahead and send these 10 values over to our topic from the Java client. From the topic, the S3 connector should pick those up and send them over into our S3 bucket. So here back in StreamNative UI, we can see that the connector says that it has sent 10 messages. And if I go over to my Amazon S3 bucket, Pulsar connector, you can see that it's now created a folder or an object called S3 tenant. That's my tenant. In there is a folder called S3 namespace. In there is a folder called my S3 topic. And it started putting JSON files here. Let me go ahead and download both of these. So if I select them, let's say actions. Actually, maybe if I just click on it, yep, I can go ahead and download it once I click on it. We'll open that file, and you'll be able to see that the first file contains 3 messages. And if we go back and download the second file and open that one, we'll see that that one contains the remaining 7 messages.